Here is a big controversial question when it comes to intelligence. Is it genetic? Are you born with it? Or is it environmental? Is it something that you learn from the environment and develop your intelligence that way? Or is it something that you're just born with? You might just have a natural gift. Well, researchers in genetics look at many different characteristics of people, and they develop ways of kind of looking at the measuring the genetic component, and that's the heritability coefficient is a statistic that allows us to estimate the contribution of heredity to a particular characteristic. And basically, heritability coefficient for intelligence is typically about 0.5, which is pretty high, indicating that there is good evidence that intelligence is genetic. Twin studies. There is a greater correlation among identical twins' intelligence scores, 0.86, than fraternal twins. This means that genetics does play a huge role. Now, does that mean that genetics is the only thing? No. Family and home environment also play a role. Sibling studies. If they're adopted non-biological siblings raised together, they still have a pretty decent correlation. And biological siblings raised apart, it's a correlation, but not quite as high. So both family environment does that, as well as genetics do matter. School plays a role too, both a cause and a result. Your intelligence is related to how successful you're going to be in school, so your intelligence will predict your success. But also going to school and doing the things at school will improve your intelligence. Kind of like what we were talking about with the Flynn effect, is that you going to school and learning all these complex things is going to improve your measured intelligence. So let's take a look at these genetic influences here on this chart. Studies of twins, family members, adopted children. There is a significant genetic contribution to intelligence. Fraternal twins and identical twins reared together. The first column and the third column show you that for identical twins, there's a significantly larger correlation for identical twins than fraternal twins. So they're raised in the same environment, but they're showing differences. That the correlation is different. Identical twins are closer in intelligence than fraternal twins. That shows a genetic effect. However, identical twins reared apart versus raised together show that there is an environmental effect as well. So the first two columns, if you compare them, you see that identical twins reared apart, the correlation is not quite as high. Still pretty high, not quite as high as identical twins reared together. So your environment and your genetics working together is important to consider. Adopted children show some marginal correlation in verbal abilities to their adoptive parents, but really there tends to be a closer relationship between the adopted children and their birth parents than the adopted children and their adoptive parents. Again, showing an effect of genetics. We have to pay attention, though, to environmental influences. Fraternal twins raised together show similarity in intelligence scores. Identical twins raised apart show slightly less similarity. So we need to recognize the environmental influences. This brings up some controversy here. This has to do with ethnic differences and similarities when it comes to intelligence. One of the things that has been shown is that the different groups from the different racial groups differ in their average intelligence scores. High-scoring people also tend to be more likely to achieve high levels of education and income. So, we've got a circumstance perhaps where certain groups, based on their ethnicity, may have kind of like, their scores on average are lower, and lower scores predict less success. So that's a problem. if we look at racial differences, white Americans score higher in average intelligence than black Americans, and this has been shown. The average IQ for white Americans is 100. Average for IQ for black Americans is 85. Hispanic Americans kind of in between. European New Zealanders score higher than the native New Zealanders. So it's not just here. So the question to ask is why? Is it because there are genetic differences between black people and white people? Is that what it is? I think it's too simplistic to say that. We have to consider environmental effects. If you are raised in a nourishing, intellectually stimulating environment, you are going to do better no matter where your genetics are. So if you look at these flowers here, there's going to be some variation here. There's also going to be some variation here. Some flowers are going to grow higher here. Some flowers are going to grow higher. Some flowers are going to grow lower. And it has to do with differences genetically. However, if all of the flowers are in poor soil, then all of them are not going, then none of them are going to grow that high. If it's in fertile soil, they'll all grow higher, but there will still be some variation. So this is indication of environmental effects when it comes to intelligence, and that, if a person grows up in a very nourishing environment, no matter what the genetics are, they're going to have a better chance for success. So here are some reasons why environment can affect our intelligence when it comes to differences between the races. Well, for one thing, genetically, the races are very much alike. Whether you're black or white, genetically, there really isn't much difference at the genetic level. Okay? So something else besides the genes must be going on. It has to do with perhaps how people are treated in our culture, depending on what your skin color is. Furthermore, race is a social category. It's not a biological distinction. We have certain ideas about what a black person is based on certain physical features, but it is not a biological category at all. There are differences, in skin tone and in the shape of the nose and whatnot, but it is really just a social category that we've come up with in our society to identify some people belong to this race, some people belong to that race. How about this one? Asian students are performing better than white students on math tests and aptitude tests. Is this because Asians are genetically more intelligent than white people? I don't think that would be the case. I think that there are environmental differences that play a role. One of those differences, you have to think about the cultural differences. There might be certain cultural attitudes that are different between North American white people and Asian people. Consider this. If you do well in school, your child does well in school here in the United States. You're a white person, your child does well in school. You might be tempted to praise that child for how smart he or she is. You might even put a bumper sticker on your car that says, "My darling daughter is an honor student at so-and-so middle school." Okay? Which is all very nice to be able to show everybody else how smart your bundle of joy is. Well, Asian parents kind of take a different tack. Their issue is more about your effort. You do well because you worked hard. When you don't do well, it is because you didn't work hard enough. White parent might look at a child who does not do so well at math and say, well, I guess math is not your strong point, but at least you're good at English. Well, Asian parents aren't going to take that tack. They're going to say that you need to work harder at math in order to do better. And therefore, it's this push to be for effortful work. And again, we talked about earlier how effortful thinking in terms of solving problems. You got to exercise that system too. Don't just rely on your intuition. So maybe Asian students put more effort into what they do because it's been instilled upon them to do so, while white students might kind of take their idea that this is their level of intelligence, this is what their capabilities are, and they kind of work from there. Furthermore, another thing to consider is that no matter what color you are, if you're growing up here in the 2010s, you're going to be a lot better off than someone growing up in the 1930s. You're going to do better on those intelligence tests without a question, because you're better prepared. You're exposed to computers. You're exposed to technology. You are dealing and coping with a much more complex world now than you were in the 1930s. And therefore, this should be considered in terms of your level of, this will improve your intelligence scores. Here's something else. There really is no difference between white and black infants when it comes to tests of predicting future intelligence. White and black, when you're really young, no difference. Something is happening when the children are getting older, and maybe the children are being exposed to different prejudices, different expectations that might be held for black students versus white students, and therefore you're going to see some differences that develop over time based on the culture that you live in, not necessarily based on your genetics. Finally, something to consider is that it hasn't always been about black and white. There have been different ethnic groups that have had issues in the past in terms of like having, there's been stereotypes about them not being very intelligent or whatnot, or other, or vice versa, where they do great, achieve great things. So there have been different stereotypes involved in different ethnic groups as time goes on. Something you might not know. There used to be a saying a long time ago, early 1900s. There was an expression that a Jew was born with a basketball in his hands. Let me repeat that. A Jew was born with a basketball in his hands. Well, you know where that expression came from? Back in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, a lot of Jewish kids played basketball, and they became professional basketball players. If you look at professional basketball players from like the 1930s, a lot of them were Jewish. Now look at the NBA today. You don't find too many Jewish basketball players. Well, because times have changed, and cultures have experienced different circumstances over time. Jewish people moved out of the inner cities and moved to the suburbs, and they've experienced different things in the next generations. So yeah, today there aren't that many Jewish basketball players, but in the 1930s there were a whole lot of them. There were also a whole lot of Jewish boxers, which is again not associated with Jewish people today. But if you look at the history of boxing and look at the history of professional basketball, you find a lot of Jewish people there. And again, it has to do with the different ethnic groups kind of like in different circumstances at different times in a culture. And therefore, to look at differences now, realizing that in 100 years things might be quite different.